Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The air in the room changed the moment my mother stood up, the sound of her chair scraping against the polished floor sending a ripple of unease through the guests. I should have known she couldn't help herself, that she wouldn't be able to sit quietly and let the spotlight belong to anyone but her. It wasn't enough for her to be the mother of the bride, she needed to be the main event. And so, with that self-satisfied smirk stretched across her lips, she took center stage in a moment that was supposed to be mine. "Before we begin," she said, her voice smooth and practiced like she had rehearsed this in the mirror, "I just want to say, my daughter could have done better." A few people gasped, the kind of sharp intake of breath that signaled they were processing what had just happened. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if this was some kind of inside joke they weren't in on. But I knew better. This wasn't a joke, and it certainly wasn't unexpected. This was classic Diane. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might actually throw up right there in my wedding dress. For a split second, my vision blurred, my brain frantically trying to decide between fight, flight, or curling up in a ball on the floor. This was my mother's power, her ability to strip me of confidence in a matter of seconds, to make me feel like I was a child again, standing in front of her with my shoulders hunched as she pointed out my every flaw. But then, before I could say anything, before I could even breathe, Jack stepped forward. Calm as ever, like he had been expecting this moment, like he had been waiting for it. He reached for the microphone, his fingers grazing mine as he took it from my shaking hand. He turned toward her, smiled so easily it almost looked affectionate, and said in a voice as smooth as silk, "Funny, because we were just about to cut you off." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that sucks all the air out of a room and leaves nothing but raw, electric tension in its place. And my mother? She stood there, frozen, her expression stuck somewhere between shock and indignation. It was the first time I had ever seen her at a loss for words. God, it was beautiful. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, watching, feeling the moment sink into my skin like the sun warming my face after a long winter. The weight of years of manipulation, belittlement, and emotional blackmail started to lift from my shoulders. And Jack? He just stood beside me, his presence steady and unwavering, like he had been built for this exact moment. My mother's lips parted, her breath hitching as she tried to come up with something, anything, that would put her back in control of the situation. But it was too late. Jack had already won. Let me tell you something about my husband. He is the kindest, most patient man I have ever met, but he is also a man who knows how to play the long game. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment clapback. No, this was planned. This was calculated. And my mother? She had just walked straight into a trap we had been setting for months. I had spent my whole life trying to please that woman, bending myself into shapes I didn't recognize just to hear some kind of approval from her lips. But approval was never the goal, not really. She didn't want me to succeed, she wanted me to need her. She wanted to be the voice in my head, the shadow in my life, the ever-present hand on my shoulder reminding me that I wasn't enough on my own. When I met Jack, I think she saw it before I did. She saw how he loved me without conditions, without trying to mold me into something else. And she hated it. She hated him, hated what he represented. Because if I could be loved, truly, deeply loved, without her permission, then what power did she have left? The answer was simple, none. She had spent the entire wedding planning process making my life hell, inserting herself into every detail, trying to turn my day into her show. She had opinions about everything, and when I dared to disagree, she made it clear she would rather see the whole thing fall apart than let me have something she couldn't control. The dress was wrong, the venue was wrong, the guest list was wrong. Even my choice of flowers, peonies, my absolute favorite, was a problem for her. Too soft, she had said, wrinkling her nose in disapproval. Too fragile. They won't hold up. Like always, there was a hidden message in her words. She had been testing me, pushing, waiting for me to cave. And for a while, I almost did. Years of conditioning don't just disappear overnight. But Jack? Jack saw what was happening, and he wasn't going to let her win. So we made a plan. We knew she would try something at the wedding. We just didn't know what. But when she stood up in front of everyone and said those 6 little words, she made our job easy. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a second, then held it up so everyone could see. The sound of her voice filled the room. A recorded phone call. I mean, honestly, I hope she does end up alone. Serves her right for being such an ungrateful little bitch her whole life. There it was. The real Diane. I watched her face drain of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She knew. She knew there was no coming back from this. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the kind of stunned reactions that told me we had just ended her reign for good. Jack turned to me, a question in his eyes, giving me the chance to decide how far we would take this. And in that moment, standing there in my white dress with my mother's words still hanging in the air, I realized something. I didn't have to fight for her approval anymore. I didn't have to shrink myself to fit into the narrow little box she had built for me. So I did the only thing that felt right. I took Jack's hand, smiled, and said, I think it's time we started the ceremony. And just like that, I took my life back. My mother has always been the kind of woman who fills every room she enters with the weight of her presence, demanding attention without ever having to raise her voice. She perfected the art of condescension so thoroughly that people often mistook her cruelty for sophistication, as if her insults were simply clever observations rather than deliberate attempts to make everyone around her feel small. If she paid you a compliment, you could be sure there was a blade hidden somewhere between the words, sharp enough to leave a mark long after she had moved on to her next victim. I spent my entire childhood learning how to survive under her scrutiny, memorizing the rhythms of her moods like a soldier studying the movements of an enemy camp, always preparing for the next inevitable attack. She didn't raise me so much as she tolerated me, as if my very existence were some sort of inconvenience she had been forced to endure. I learned early on that love in our household was conditional, a prize to be won through obedience and quiet suffering rather than something given freely. If I spoke too loudly, I was dramatic. If I cried, I was weak. If I dared to push back against one of her cruel little observations, I was difficult or disrespectful. She had a way of making me feel as though I was fundamentally broken, as if I were some defective product she had been saddled with and forced to pretend she was proud of. When I was 7 years old, I overheard her on the phone with a friend, laughing as she said, honestly, if I had known what she'd be like, I would have stopped at 1. I don't know if she realized I was listening, and I don't know if she would have cared if she had. By the time I was 10, I had learned not to expect kindness from her, because kindness was something she used sparingly, a currency she only handed out when she wanted something in return. If she hugged me, it was only in front of other people, where she could perform the role of the loving mother for an audience that would never see the sharpness of her smile once their backs were turned. She never said, I love you, unless it was to manipulate me into doing something she wanted, her voice always carrying that sickly sweet edge that made the words feel more like a transaction than an expression of genuine affection. She wanted a daughter she could control, a miniature version of herself who would reflect her own superiority back at her like a perfectly polished mirror. But I wasn't that. I was too quiet, too awkward, too unwilling to bend myself into the shape she demanded I take. I didn't grow up into the flawless socialite she had envisioned. I was clumsy, shy, and too quick to apologize for things that weren't my fault. Every time I failed to meet her impossible expectations, she acted as though I had embarrassed her personally, as if my flaws were not just my own, but a direct reflection of her failure as a mother. When I got my first job at 16, she didn't congratulate me or tell me she was proud. I should have known better than to expect that. Instead, she looked me up and down, unimpressed, and said, "At least you'll have something to fall back on when you inevitably screw up college." I should have known, even back then, that she would never be capable of seeing me as anything other than a disappointment waiting to happen. By the time I met Jack, I had already spent most of my life trying to prove that I was worthy of love, that I was enough, not just to her, but to myself. I had spent years unlearning the lessons she had drilled into me, slowly rewiring my brain to accept that I didn't have to be perfect to be deserving of happiness. But the thing about mothers like mine is that they don't let go of their control easily, and they don't forgive you for escaping their grasp. Jack saw it before I did, the way she twisted her love into something that felt more like a weapon than a comfort. He noticed the way my shoulders tensed whenever she called, the way I shrank into myself whenever she was in the room. He saw the way I second-guessed myself over things that should have been simple, my voice hesitating on words that had been stolen from me long before I had ever met him. And most importantly, he saw her for what she was, a woman who would rather see me alone and broken than happy and beyond her reach. She hated him from the moment she met him, though she was too skilled at playing the role of the gracious mother to let it show right away. Instead, she planted her seeds of doubt carefully, slipping them into casual conversations as if they were nothing more than passing thoughts. He's sweet, but don't you think he's a little boring? I don't know, honey. I just get the feeling he's hiding something. I worry that you're settling, that's all. But it wasn't that she thought I deserved better, it was that she thought I deserved nothing at all. When she realized her subtle manipulations weren't working, she escalated. She pulled Jack aside at dinner one night, a smile plastered across her face so perfect that anyone watching would have thought she was the picture of motherly concern. And then she said the words that made my blood run cold. You know, you don't have to marry her out of pity. She had underestimated him. She had expected him to flinch, to second-guess, to let her words worm their way under his skin like they always had with me. But Jack? He just smiled, leaned in slightly, and said in the most casual voice imaginable, "Oh, I'm not. I'm doing it out of revenge." I wish I could have seen the look on her face in that moment, but I was too busy sitting at the table, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired between them. It wasn't until later that night, when we were alone, that Jack told me what she had said, and what he had said back. At first, I didn't understand. Revenge? What did he mean by that? He just smiled, pressed a kiss to my forehead, and said, "You'll see." I always thought planning a wedding would be one of those magical, once-in-a-lifetime experiences where everything feels like it's falling into place, where love is at the center of every decision, and where the people closest to you lift you up rather than drag you down. But that was before I realized that my mother was going to treat this wedding not as a joyous occasion, but as her last chance to remind me that she was still in control. From the moment I told her that Jack had proposed, I could see something flicker in her eyes, not excitement, not happiness, but something else entirely, something that felt more like calculation than celebration. It was as if she had already started making a mental list of all the ways she could twist this into something that revolved around her instead of me. At first, it started with the small things, the little comments that seemed harmless on the surface, but were laced with the usual brand of condescension that I had been dealing with my entire life. She told me the dress I loved was too simple and suggested something more flattering, which was her way of saying that I would look terrible in what I had chosen. She insisted on helping with the guest list, only to try to remove half of my friends while adding people I had never even met, including distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, but suddenly deemed important enough to be at my wedding. She criticized the venue, complained about the catering, and made it clear in every possible way that if I didn't listen to her, I would be making the worst mistake of my life. But then, just when I thought she couldn't possibly get any worse, she crossed a line that made my blood boil in a way I had never experienced before. One afternoon, while I was finalizing the details with my florist, a lovely woman named Carol who had been nothing but kind and accommodating, my mother decided to take matters into her own hands. Without telling me, she called Carol and canceled my entire order, replacing my carefully chosen bouquet with something she thought would be better. When I found out, I was so furious that I could barely form a coherent sentence, my hands shaking as I held the phone and listened to Carol explain that she had assumed my mother had my permission to make the changes. I confronted her that same evening, my voice sharper than I had ever dared to use with her before, demanding to know why she thought she had the right to make decisions about my wedding without even consulting me. And she just smiled, that same infuriating smirk she always wore when she knew she had gotten under my skin, and said, "I was only trying to help, sweetheart. You always get so emotional about these things, and I thought you'd appreciate having someone take care of it for you." That was the moment I knew there was no reasoning with her, no amount of arguing that would make her see how deeply selfish she was being. It wasn't about the flowers. It wasn't about the dress, or the guest list, or any of the other things she had tried to change. It was about power. It was about making sure I never forgot that no matter how much I tried to break away, she would always find a way to remind me that she could still reach into my life and rearrange things as she saw fit. Jack had been patient through all of it, watching as I tried, again and again, to set boundaries that she bulldozed right through without a second thought. But after the florist incident, he sat me down and said something that changed everything. "We don't have to play defense anymore," he told me, his expression calm but unwavering. "We don't have to keep waiting for her next move. If she wants a game, let's give her one." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. I had spent my entire life reacting to my mother's manipulations, always on the receiving end of her carefully calculated attacks, always struggling to catch my breath after she knocked me down. The idea that we could flip the script and take the power away from her felt almost impossible, like trying to turn back the tide with nothing but my bare hands. But Jack? He wasn't just suggesting we stand up to her. He was suggesting we beat her at her own game. It didn't take long for us to find the secret, something so good, so damning, so perfectly timed that we knew it would be the final nail in her coffin. It was something that she had been hiding for years, something that, if exposed, would turn her entire world upside down in a way that she would never be able to recover from. And the best part? She had no idea we knew. Jack had stumbled upon it by accident, a passing comment from my father during a conversation they had one afternoon, a throwaway remark that didn't seem important at the time. But when Jack looked into it, when he started pulling at the thread, he found something that made even him pause, a discovery so big that it made every petty insult, every cruel comment, every underhanded manipulation suddenly feel laughably insignificant. We sat on it for weeks, waiting, watching as she continued to dig her own grave, oblivious to the fact that we were already holding the shovel. She was so confident, so assured of her own superiority, that she never once considered the possibility that she might not be the one pulling the strings this time. Every time she made another snide remark about Jack, every time she tried to make me feel small, I just smiled, knowing that the moment was coming, the moment when she would stand up at my wedding, thinking she had the power to humiliate me one last time, only to realize that she had walked straight into a trap that we had built just for her. And that's exactly what happened. She stood up, in front of everyone, and delivered her final act of cruelty, believing, truly believing, that she was about to ruin my happiness in the way she had always dreamed of. But instead, she watched in stunned silence as Jack took the microphone, smiled that slow, knowing smile, and said, "Funny, because we were just about to cut you off." And then, in front of every single person she had tried to impress, we destroyed her. The moment Jack spoke, the entire room shifted, as if an invisible force had sucked the air from everyone's lungs at once, leaving nothing but silence and the electrified tension of people who knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. My mother, still seated at her carefully selected front row table, still basking in the satisfaction of her latest attempt to humiliate me, barely even reacted at first, because she hadn't yet realized what was happening. She still thought she was in control, still thought she was the one holding the knife, still thought that I would sit there and take it like I had always done before. But this time, she was wrong. Jack's voice was calm, his words deliberate, and that was what made it so much worse for her. If he had been angry, if he had lashed out or raised his voice, it would have given her something to cling to, a way to twist the narrative so she could paint herself as the victim. But instead, he spoke with the kind of steady confidence that came from knowing you had already won before the fight had even started. He wasn't reacting to her, he was revealing her. The words hit her like a slap across the face, though she tried to keep her expression neutral, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, the moment she realized she had walked straight into something she wasn't prepared for. But by then, it was far too late. For years, Jack continued, his voice carrying through the hushed room. Diane has been stealing money from her ex-husband. He gestured toward my father, who sat frozen in place, his face a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. Under the guise of alimony adjustments and unexpected expenses, funneling the extra cash into a series of accounts she thought no one would ever find. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd, a wave of murmured disbelief as people turned to look at my mother, waiting to see her reaction. But she didn't say anything, not yet, because she was still calculating, still trying to find an angle that would allow her to regain control of the situation before it spiraled beyond her reach. Jack didn't stop. He pulled out his phone and held it up, showing the screen to the guests seated closest to him before turning it toward the projector we had set up for the reception. And then, with one tap, the screen behind us lit up with a series of documents, bank statements, transaction histories, wire transfers, and emails, all laid out in perfect clarity. Each one a piece of undeniable proof that my mother had been siphoning money for years. It was meticulous. It was damning. And it was undeniably real. My mother shot up from her seat so quickly that her chair tipped backward, the loud thud of it hitting the floor cutting through the murmurs of the guests. Her face was flushed, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to form words, as she fought to maintain the composure she had spent her entire life perfecting. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp, but not nearly as confident as it usually was. "This is clearly some kind of mistake. I don't know what kind of sick joke you think you're playing," but Jack didn't let her finish. "It's not a joke, Diane," he said, his voice still maddeningly calm, still holding that same quiet authority that told everyone, that he had complete control of the situation. "And it's not a mistake. These accounts belong to you. These transactions lead directly back to your name. And if anyone here is wondering whether we might have made an error, well," he turned his head slightly, looking toward the back of the room where two figures had just entered. "I'd be happy to let these gentlemen explain it to you." Heads turned, necks craned, and then a fresh wave of gasps rippled through the crowd as people recognized who had just walked in. Two men, dressed in dark suits, with expressions that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Federal investigators. The color drained from my mother's face so fast that for a split second, I thought she might actually faint, but she caught herself, her nails digging into the table as if grounding herself with the physical sensation of it might somehow bring her back into control. It wouldn't. "We were going to wait until after the honeymoon to do this," Jack continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "but since you decided to make today about you, I figured, why not go ahead and get it over with?" And just like that, the mask finally slipped. All the years she had spent carefully curating her image, all the time she had invested in making sure she was always the one in charge, all the effort she had put into ensuring that I would always be the one left humiliated. It all came crashing down in an instant. She looked around, eyes darting from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, who might come to her defense, who might help her salvage the wreckage of her reputation before it was completely destroyed. But no one did. My father, who had been quiet up until now, stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a deliberate movement that made the tension in the room even heavier. He looked at my mother, his expression unreadable, then turned to the investigators and said, "I assume you'll be needing a formal statement?" The shorter of the two men nodded. "Yes, sir. If you'd be willing to come with us, we can go over everything in detail." My mother made a choked noise, part disbelief, part desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "Are you seriously going along with this?" she demanded, her voice rising, the careful elegance she had always maintained cracking apart at the edges. "After everything, after all these years, you're going to stand there and, you did this to yourself, Diane," my father said, his voice quiet but firm, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before: finality. She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Because she knew. She knew she had lost. The men in suits stepped forward, one reaching into his pocket and pulling out a neatly folded document, which he handed to her with a clipped, professional tone. "Mrs. Langley, this is a formal notice of investigation into financial fraud, wire fraud, and unlawful misappropriation of funds. You are not under arrest at this time, but you are strongly advised to retain legal counsel immediately." She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, frozen, as the weight of what was happening finally settled over her. And me? I stood beside Jack, my husband, the man who had helped me end this, and watched as the woman who had spent her whole life making me feel small finally learned what it felt like to lose everything. The moment the truth settled into the room, it was like something had cracked open, a dam bursting under the weight of years of unspoken tension, sending a flood of whispers and murmurs rippling through the wedding guests like shockwaves. People exchanged glances, hushed conversations breaking out in clusters as my mother stood frozen in place, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, her carefully constructed mask of superiority slipping away with every second that passed. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before, not anger, not condescension, not calculated cruelty, but fear. She tried to recover, tried to reach for the same well-worn tactics she had used for years, the ones that had always worked before. She shook her head, let out a sharp, breathless laugh, as if she expected everyone to suddenly realize this was all some kind of absurd misunderstanding. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice laced with the forced confidence of a woman who had spent her entire life talking her way out of things she had no business escaping. "You all know me. Does anyone here seriously believe I would do something like this?" But the problem was they did. The silence that followed her question was damning in a way that no amount of evidence could have ever been. She looked around, searching for someone, anyone, who might step in to defend her, but all she found were averted gazes and the quiet, uncomfortable weight of people realizing they had probably ignored far too many red flags over the years. She had spent a lifetime carefully curating her image, making sure she was always the smartest person in the room, always the one in control, always the one with the last word. But now, standing there in the middle of my wedding, with the proof of her own greed and deception laid bare for everyone to see, she suddenly seemed so small. My father was the one to finally break the silence, the one person who had remained completely still, completely unreadable, through the entire spectacle. He had spent years allowing her to dictate the terms of his existence, had let her twist and manipulate and demand, had given her more patience and grace than she had ever deserved. But as he stood from his chair, as he slowly turned to look at the woman he had once loved, something in his face shifted, something firm and unwavering settling into his features as he met her wide, desperate eyes. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, a final sentence handed down without room for negotiation. And just like that, it was over. She stood there for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form a response, as if struggling to comprehend that this was actually happening. But she knew. She knew there was no talking her way out of this, no charming or manipulating or gaslighting her way back into control. The room was watching. Everyone had seen. And so, with no other option left, she did the only thing she could do. She turned and walked out. I didn't watch her go. I didn't need to. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor, sharp and angry, was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She was furious. She was humiliated. She was drowning in the unbearable realization that for the first time in her life, she had lost. And the best part? Jack and I had been waiting for this day, not just to expose her, not just to finally put an end to her endless cycle of manipulation and control. No, this was personal. Because years ago, when I was still just a teenager, still naive enough to think that maybe, if I tried hard enough, I could earn her love, she had done something I never forgot, something that had haunted me for years. She had stood in front of my entire school, in front of all of my friends, and humiliated me in a way that only she knew how. It had been an awards ceremony, a small recognition for students who had excelled in different academic fields. I had worked my ass off to be there, to have my name called, to walk across that stage and feel, just for a moment, like I had finally done something she could be proud of. But when I stood up, when I turned to look at her in the audience, expecting to see some hint of pride, some small sign that I had finally done enough, she just smiled and shook her head. And then, loud enough for the entire row of parents beside her to hear, she leaned toward them and said, "It's cute, isn't it? How hard she tries." They had laughed. I had heard them. I had walked onto that stage feeling so small, so stupid, so utterly worthless. And she had known exactly what she was doing. But now, as I turned to look at the empty chair where she had been sitting, as I stood in the place where I had chosen to be celebrated, where I had people who actually loved me surrounding me, where I had a husband who had stood beside me through all of this, I knew that this was our moment. This wedding wasn't just about love, it was about reclaiming everything she had tried to take from me. She had always made sure I felt small. And now? Now she finally knew how it felt. Jack reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, anchoring me in that moment, grounding me in the reality that for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. I smiled, let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding, and turned back toward the altar. "We're ready to begin," I said. And as I walked down that aisle, past her empty chair, past the remnants of the woman who had spent her life trying to break me, I knew she would never get the last word again.